We'll start with Chris Tomlinson, whose presentation is called Oil Company Strategies for Carbon Capture and Climate Technologies.
Thank you, Randall. I'm not sure what I'm doing up here with all these esteemed professors. So it makes perfect sense that I'm just going to kind of start you out with some basics and hopefully set up what I think is going to be a fascinating conversation. It might help if I take my notes out. We talk about fossil fuels, but when it comes to oil and natural gas, we're specifically talking about hydrocarbons. Hydrocarbons are organic compounds consisting entirely of hydrogen and carbon. They are found in crude oil, natural gas, and coal. They can be refined to create many different forms of fuel, from diesel to gasoline to methane. They store energy which is released when the bonds are broken, usually through combustion with oxygen. When this is done perfectly, the hydrogen and carbon atoms break apart and combine with the oxygen, leaving you with water, H2O, and carbon dioxide, or CO2. Once we figured out how to extract oil and natural gas and refine them into fuel, an energy transition took place. We no longer relied on wood and whale blubber. We began using oil. Not far from here, at a place called Spindletop, most of you know, in Beaumont, Texans discovered oil, and hydrocarbons have set the Texas and Houston economy apart ever since. Investors value oil and gas companies based primarily on how much they own in proven reserves. Now, proven reserves are the number of barrels and barrels of oil equivalent they can profitably extract from the property they control. The big integrated oil companies can add more value based on their refining and petrochemical facilities and their retail operations. But, fundamentally, it's the amount of oil and natural gas they've found that's the basis of their share price. Here are the biggest publicly traded oil companies based on their stock price or market cap. These companies alone are valued at more than $3.5 trillion. The industry as a whole generates $4.3 trillion in revenue annually. The industry distributed $213 billion in dividends and bought back $136 billion in stock in 2024. Oil and gas companies are not only critical to the global economy as it stands today, they are critical to our financial markets. The world consumes about 100 million barrels a day, and most of that is combusted. Here you can see how our consumption has grown by examining the amount of carbon dioxide we release. The number is rising because the world's consumption of oil and gas is still going up. If you look closely, though, you can see that in some parts of the world, it's going down. The European Union and the United States especially, but carbon emissions in the developing world, particularly China, India, and the rest of Asia, are going up. The larger the proportion of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the more heat it will retain. We've known this since the 1860s. The first president to receive a briefing on the potential for hydrocarbons to change the global climate was Lyndon B. Johnson. As you can see, the rise in global temperatures almost perfectly mirrors the rise in CO2 emissions. And this is why climate change is an existential threat to oil and gas companies. The American Petroleum Institute first began denouncing climate science in 1967. The oil and gas industry has known for more than 50 years that burning their products was dangerous to human survival. Exxon CEO Rex Tillerson was still denying climate science a decade ago. But temperatures are getting too high and the science is undeniable. Two companies here are cautionary tales. British Petroleum, who once promised that they would become BP and move, quote, beyond petroleum, and Shell. Shell CEOs promised to transition away from oil to natural gas and then to become an energy company selling electricity. This was a bit of greenwashing because they all planned to tap all of their proven reserves. However, if that happens, the climate will become too hot for human life. On the other hand, if they say out loud that they're not going to produce all of their proven reserves, their stock prices are going to plummet. Investors have punished BP and Shell when they talked about climate, and the challenge is that oil and gas companies have much higher return on investments than electric utilities. If investors want to own an electric utility, they can buy one. They want BP and Shell and Exxon and all the others to be oil companies because that makes them the investors a larger return. That's why climate-minded CEOs were driven out. The new CEOs are dropping their clean energy promises, but they have a problem. If they want to stay in the hydrocarbon business, they have to deal with CO2. The energy industry is led by engineers, and engineers think engineering can solve every problem, right? This is the Petronova carbon capture facility at the Parish coal-fired power plant in Fort Bend County. Electricity generator NRG hired Mitsubishi to capture carbon dioxide from the flue gas. Petronova was one of the nation's earliest experiments commercializing what's called carbon capture utilization and storage. The idea is to turn the waste CO2 that everyone is just releasing into the atmosphere and find a profitable use for it. The system works, but it's expensive and not very efficient. NRG paid for the project by piping the CO2 to an oil field owned by Hilcorp. Hilcorp injected the CO2 into old wells that had lost their pressure. The gas forced oil up in a process called enhanced oil recovery. When done properly, the CO2 stays underground. That's a big if. As long as oil costs more than $85 a barrel, it made sense but when the price dropped and stayed below $85, NRG shut it down. Now that the company can earn $45 a ton in carbon tax credits, they're thinking about opening it back up again. Occidental Petroleum, based here in Houston, is the world's leader in applying enhanced oil recovery. For decades, they pumped natural CO2 out of wells in Colorado, piped it all the way to West Texas' Permian Basin, and then re-injected the CO2 into wells to produce oil. Now CEO Vicky Holub is experimenting with capturing CO2 directly from the air, and these huge filters are part of the Stratus project in Ector County. My co-panelists will discuss this in more detail, but the idea is to use fans to pull air through massive filters. These filters have absorbents that soak up the CO2. Then Oxy wants to inject the CO2 into the old wells and produce oil. Oxy calls this carbon negative oil because Holub claims that the wells will capture more carbon than is produced. The only way this makes sense is with carbon capture tax credits, and the oil industry wants to get paid to produce oil and then paid again to capture the CO2. They want to have us coming and going. Not all carbon capture costs the same. This chart shows how much CCUS costs depending on the source of the CO2. Planting trees and restoring a forest is the cheapest form of carbon capture at about $25 a ton. Then comes steel mills, coal-fired electric plants like Petronova, then cement plants. Direct air capture, like what Oxy is talking about, is off the charts, ranging from $150 a ton to $400 a ton. This is the big challenge. If you have to pay $65 a barrel for oil and then $150 a ton for CO2 removal, is that really affordable energy? Aren't there cheaper alternatives? This chart shows what's called the levelized cost of electricity. The idea is to make fair comparisons between different forms of generation. If you were building a new power generation facility today, onshore wind and solar is the cheapest way to go. Combined cycle natural gas, geothermal, grid scale storage, sure. But look at combined cycle gas turbines with carbon capture or coal-fired power plants with carbon capture. They are out of range. When you start adding in the cost of carbon capture, it doesn't look so good. There's also a lot of community opposition to CO2 pipelines and storage. Every time a company needs to use eminent domain to force landowners to give up space for a pipeline, there's going to be trouble. Briefly, I want to talk about the hydrogen hub proposed for Houston. Carbon capture is a critical part of this plan, and the Greater Houston Partnership is pushing this project hard. Hydrogen is, of course, the key ingredient in hydrocarbons, but isolating it is difficult and it's highly corrosive. Nevertheless, many innovators think that the best way to save the climate is to burn hydrogen instead of hydrocarbons because it doesn't produce CO2. Most hydrogen today is made from natural gas, and the technique is called steam methane reforming, and we normally just release that CO2 into the air, and that's called gray hydrogen. To make it blue, they do the same thing, but they capture the CO2 and put it in under the ocean, is what they plan to do here. The last one is to use clean energy from wind and solar to break apart water into hydrogen and oxygen. But honestly, that's still very expensive, and there might be a better way to use that electricity. The Biden administration set aside $1.2 billion for Houston to develop a hydrogen hub. Most of that money will go toward capturing the CO2 from existing systems. This is one that's being piloted out in the ship channel. And lastly, French firm Air Liquide, which generates a lot of gray hydrogen, is now trying to capture that CO2 to clean up their act. And that's another one of the key parts of the hydrogen hub, is it's all about trying to reduce the CO2 emissions that they're already doing, not really coming up with a new solution here in Houston. So the question is, what's best for consumers and the planet? The oil and gas industry desperately wants to stay in the oil and gas business. Trillions of dollars are at stake. And that's why they're pushing these technologies. I'm now going to hand over to my colleagues who will discuss this in a little more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Next is Charles Harvey. His presentation is called Why Carbon Capture is More Useful for the Oil and Gas Industry than for Reducing Emissions.
Okay, well, first, thanks very much for inviting me to this. I am thrilled to be here. I got into carbon capture and sequestration, CCS, nearly 20 years ago because I wanted to shift my academic research towards figuring out how to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I have a background in hydrogeology, so I know about how fluids flow around deep in the earth. And so it seemed like a promising direction to go to work on injecting carbon dioxide that's captured from smokestacks deep into the earth. And also, frankly, there's a lot of oil company money floating around MIT that would support this research. Now, early on in the work, we realized that there really weren't major engineering or scientific hurdles to overcome. We have known for 40, 50 years how to move CO2 around and inject it in the ground because we've been doing it for enhanced oil recovery that we just thought about. We know how to capture carbon dioxide from smokestacks because we do it for all kinds of things. In particular, we do it for producing natural gas. Because when you produce natural gas, it often has a lot of carbon dioxide into it, and you need to separate that to produce marketable methane. So instead, what a group of us did was to start a company to actually do it. And we were quite successful in the sense that we raised over $200 million. We bought mineral rights for good places to do it across the country. We had an elevator pitch that basically went like this. Coal was the main source of electricity and was growing. This was 2007. There was no alternative for electricity other than CCS on coal. Second, it looked like, believe it or not, there was going to be legislation that would encourage or require this. It's hard to believe now, but there were Republican senators who were on board for cap and trade or even a carbon tax bill. And then third, we were going to be the first movers to do this. And we had it figured out, and we were ahead of everyone. So it went well for a while. And then what happened is really just we observed the price of renewables, energy storage, and the alternatives continuing to plummet. It's just an incredible story how well these things have done, how cheap they've gotten. So we couldn't make an honest case anywhere in the country that we had the better solution. So the company may go on as an enhanced oil recovery company, but those of us who are in it for climate change left. And this is just a picture of C12, the company. Now, we were right that it wasn't going anywhere. This is a video of the largest CCS plant in Mississippi, the Kemper project, which absorbed billions of dollars in subsidies, but then was blown up intentionally before turning on. And one of the reasons I'm sure that happened is the words I wrote here, the energy penalty, because to turn it on, it takes so much energy to capture the CO2 that's produced from making energy, right, that you would have to import more electricity from somewhere else or build a whole nother power plant to run the thing. Now, the reason I'm here now is that it's back, and it's back in a big way, and I've been puzzled as to what's going on. And part of the answer is in this plot here on the amount of lobbying money spent on it. And you see a big bulge back when we had our company around 2008, and then it kind of flattened out. And recently, there's been an enormous amount of lobbying again, and the amount spent are about $750 million altogether on lobbying for this. It's also back as sort of the feedback with the lobbying because there's a lot of subsidies. There's billions of dollars in direct subsidies from the Infrastructure Act and other things, and what's called the 45Q subsidy, which pays per ton of carbon dioxide produced and injected, has been raised to $60 per ton of CO2 if you do EOR. That amounts to $30 subsidy per barrel of oil produced by EOR. Now, there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty about where it's going to go from here, as there is about everything political in the country right now. And I have a feeling that we'll get into that in the question and answer period. But what I want to do with the rest of my time is to talk about where we are right now. What is carbon dioxide, what is CCS right now in this country? And one place I went, you can go to get the information on this, is the Congressional Budget Office report from about a year ago on what is operating in the country. And there's 15 of these operating plants, according to them right now. But I want to point out that the Congressional Budget Office gets this information from the Industry Promotion Group, because the way the subsidies work as a tax refund, it's a tax refund that you can sell to someone else. So even if you don't owe any tax, it's worth something. The way it's funded through the Treasury Department, we don't actually know for sure. So I would take all of the numbers I'm going to show you as upper limits. They're the capacity, but it's probably more than is actually done. And the way to show it, I think, is with a plot like this. So here's the 15 different operating sites' capacities right now. And first I want to ask, where do they get their CO2? So more than 50% of the CO2 comes from natural gas processing. This is CO2 that was already sequestered underground, but is pumped up before being injected back underground. Where does it go? Well, there's two sites, one very small, one a little bit larger, that actually inject it just into the ground to store it. One of these sites, the only one that's been running for a while, is the Archer Daniel Midlands, Illinois site, just leaked and was shut down. Now, there's a couple very important things about this site. It's the only one that's not enhanced oil recovery, and therefore it's the only one that's actually monitored, because the regulations on CCS for monitoring they're very weak for oil fields. So we don't know what's going on there. And so that's the state of the whole system now, is that almost all of it is for enhanced oil recovery. Okay, now what I want to do is talk about how this actually works, the sort of steps of the system. And I want to go to this one site in Michigan to explain that, just mainly because they have great graphics and they make an outlandish claim that it's actually a carbon neutral system, but it's not, as you'll see. So I just want to step through how this works. First of all, natural gas up in number 1 is pumped out of the ground. It's piped over to a processing plant where natural gas is burnt in order to power the separation. That produces CO2, which is emitted to the atmosphere. So that's emission 1. The natural gas is then sold and burnt in houses or power plants. That's emission 2. The CO2 that was separated is then taken to a compression plant to compress it to the high pressures that it must be at to inject it underground. That requires more energy, so more natural gas is burnt to do that. The CO2 from burning that is released to the atmosphere. Then it's injected deep into the ground, it flushes out oil, and the mixture comes back up. And the oil then is sent to be sold, and it's combusted, which produces more CO2. So that's how the system works. And now what I want to do is show you how these numbers add up at the largest site, the site that's about 1/3 of the capacity in the country, the Exxon Chute Creek or LaBarge facility site. So this site, the gas is kind of lousy. It's about 1/5 methane and 2/3 CO2. And over the years, they've taken 1/2 of the CO2 that they pump up and used it for enhanced oil recovery, and 1/2 of it just vented to the atmosphere. So that right there makes the natural gas from this project worse than coal when you burn it for producing power. So here's how it's worked over the years. They've pumped up 240 megatons out of the ground. I'm approximating here, they emit carbon in order to do the separation. They emit more carbon in order to power the compression. And then they injected 1/2 of that CO2 back into the ground. This is what they claim as CCS. This is the big claim from Exxon. They injected 1/2 back into the ground. But they also sell the methane, which is combusted, produces more CO2. They sell the oil, which is combusted and produces more CO2. And undoubtedly, there are methane leaks in here, which is a very strong greenhouse gas. So if we add that all up, we get something like 1/2 gigaton. So I won't get into the numbers, but as it sounds, that's a big number, more than 10% of U.S. annual emissions. But this is their claim. So I don't think it's a coincidence that when Exxon advertises this, they advertise that they have, how do they put it? Well, they've captured more CO2 than anyone else, and they use the number of 120 megatons. So this is a greenhouse gas disaster that is subsidized to prevent climate change and then is advertised as a climate solution. Okay, so I want to end just with perhaps a response to the broadest kind of criticism that I have heard of our work or promotion of CCS, and that's the notion that to fight climate change we have to do all of the above. We have to use every tool in the tool chest. I've heard this so many times, and it sounds kind of compelling, and you can couple it with a concern about climate change to sort of bring people along, but there's a couple problems with it. So what I've done here is just drawn a diagram with a gazillion different technologies that you could bring to play. And first of all, there's a whole set of these things that actually increase emissions. So I think we can all agree that that doesn't belong in all of the above. It's just a bad idea all around. And then there's another set, so outside of the inner circle here, there's another set that's just very expensive. Okay, and this, I want you to understand, this is a huge opportunity cost, because if we do things like clean coal, actually you could put some reduce emissions with that. It's so expensive that you are losing a tremendous opportunity to use those resources for any number of other technologies which would have reduced greenhouse gases in the atmosphere by much more. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. Next is Robert Haworth. His presentation is called Methane Emissions Make Blue Hydrogen and LNG Climate Disasters.
Thank you very much. It's a true honor to be with you here tonight, and thank you all for coming. I'm very pleased to be part of this panel of thoughtful, distinguished experts. You've been hearing that climate change is real, carbon dioxide is bad, and you've heard a little bit about methane. I want to talk more about methane. Natural gas is overwhelmingly methane as it's used. Once it gets into a pipeline, natural gas is 90 to 95, 97% methane. And methane is a big problem. I want to start, though, with the climate issue. And I want to show this quote from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The world's experts brought together under the auspices of the United Nations in their strongest consensus statement from 3 years ago, say that climate change is a threat to human well-being and that we have very limited time to act on it. This was written 3 years ago. They basically concluded that we need to cut our fossil fuel emissions in half within the next decade from now and to virtually zero by 2050. Fossil fuels are our biggest problem. Now, I want to talk about methane and natural gas, and this is also from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from a few years ago. And they concluded that, yes, carbon dioxide is the biggest greenhouse gas out there. It's responsible for 50% of the warming from all greenhouse gases that we've experienced over the last few hundred years. But methane is right up there. 30% of the warming we've experienced since the Industrial Revolution has come from methane. Very, very powerful gas. So many people are surprised to learn that the United States is now the world's largest producer of gas. We're the world's largest exporter of gas. Natural gas production globally has been stable for the last 20 years, except in the United States, where it's risen tremendously. Our gas now in the U.S. is almost all shale gas from high-volume hydraulic fracking, and that has substantial methane emissions. My research suggests that a third of the global increase in methane from all sources, all countries, all industries, over the last decade or so has been from shale gas development in the United States. That's an issue. So I want to talk just briefly about blue hydrogen, and you've heard about blue hydrogen. It's hydrogen made from natural gas. The methane in the gas is the feedstock. Natural gas also powers the production of this process. Why is industry so interested in blue hydrogen? Well, they're promoting carbon capture at power plants, but no one thinks, even the industry doesn't claim, that carbon capture works at the scale of individual homes. So they came up with this idea of having centralized plants where you turn natural gas into hydrogen, capture the carbon there, and then put the hydrogen through the pipeline system to homes. And there are a variety of reasons that's a silly idea. But I want to address particularly the blue hydrogen footprint. Industry promotes this as having a zero or very low greenhouse gas footprint, and that's just plain wrong. Working with Mark Jacobson, very talented engineer at Stanford, we published a peer-reviewed paper a few years ago now, almost 4 years. It's the first peer-reviewed analysis looking at blue hydrogen. Again, this is hydrogen made from fossil gas with CO2 capture. And this is one of our figures. If you look at the left is the gray hydrogen you've heard about so far, hydrogen as it's made from natural gas with no carbon capture. The next two bars over are blue hydrogen, either as it's been practiced to date or if industry really tried harder to get CO2 capture. And then we're comparing it with natural gas, diesel, oil, and coal. And here the yellow emissions are carbon dioxide emissions, and the red are methane emissions converted to carbon dioxide equivalents. So what you can see is that when we go with carbon capture for blue hydrogen, the footprint goes down from gray hydrogen, CO2 emissions go down, but the methane emissions go up, and that's because of the energy penalty that Charlie was referring to. It takes natural gas to power the carbon capture. That means that the methane emissions associated with natural gas go up. In fact, blue hydrogen has a substantial greenhouse gas footprint. It's larger than if one were simply to burn natural gas. It's nothing low emitting about it in the least. I want to turn briefly to LNG, liquefied natural gas. LNG was banned in terms of exports from the U.S. until 2016. It's grown rapidly as an export since. We're now the world's largest exporter. And I also produced a greenhouse gas footprint paper on this, which I published about 6 months ago now. I'll briefly run through that. This is one of the figures. We're looking here at different types of tankers and different lengths of cruises. I won't bore you with the details. Blue are the direct carbon dioxide emissions from the LNG that's delivered to market. Yellow are carbon dioxide emissions from the energy that goes into fracking and transporting and supercooling to produce liquefied natural gas. And the red, again, are methane emissions. And you'll see that the methane emissions are larger than the direct emissions from CO2 from final combustion in every case. Most of these methane emissions occur at the time of shale gas production and transport. They occur before you even get to the LNG plant, and they're significant. If we compare LNG with different fuels, here I'm looking at the two blue bars are liquefied natural gas for the world's shortest and the world's longest average cruises, sort of average tanker types, normalized here to the greenhouse gas emissions per energy produced. And I'm comparing with natural gas, coal, diesel, oil. LNG has the largest greenhouse gas footprint of any fossil fuel because of the high methane emissions. And I just want to point out, reiterating what you've already heard to some extent, there are alternatives. So that little tiny green bar there to the right, that is using heat pumps in the European sphere, heat pumps driven by the current average grid electricity in Europe, which is a substantial fossil fuel thing. But even with substantial fossil fuel inputs, heat pumps have a far, far, far lower footprint. And LNG simply is not an acceptable fuel. Now, the author, Bill McKibben, talked me into releasing a preprint of my paper well in advance of when it was published, way back in the fall of 2023. And he promoted my message heavily, and the Biden administration picked up on that. They had a decision to make in late 2023, early 2024, because the law said that once you reached a quota of LNG exports, which we were reaching, in order to justify more, the president had to sign an executive order saying it was in the national interest of the U.S. to do so. President Biden cited my paper personally in a press conference when he called for a pause on further LNG exports in January of 2024. He also called for the Department of Energy to take a close look and see if I was right or not, and also to look at the economic aspects. And that has not made me popular with the fossil fuel industry. This is from Wall Street Journal from a year ago. I actually don't consider myself a climate scientist. I'm a methane expert, but it is true they don't like my research. The Department of Energy in December came out with a report that Biden ordered them to do, and I won't go through this in huge detail, except that the Secretary of Energy in her summary said it does not make sense to continue to increase more LNG from the U.S. And she also points out that even without dropping the pause, which of course President Trump did on his first day in office, that we already have enough capacity for LNG export that if it were fully used, we would use half of the production of natural gas in the United States to be exported. And they go on and say that that would be hugely inflationary to gas prices in the United States, to electric prices in the United States, and to anything that involves using those, including fertilizer and agricultural products. On the climate side, the Department of Energy said they weren't sure things were quite as bad as I said, although they said they couldn't disagree with my study. But they also pointed out that the real choice is not that LNG will displace coal when we export it. It displaces renewable energy, and therefore was really, really a bad idea. Now, I just want to say a little bit more about where the methane comes from. People refer to it as leaks all the time, and my good friend and colleague Charlie just referred to it as leaks, and I sometimes take objection to that. Leaks implies that it's an accident and there's a valve out there, and if you get your super big wrench, you tighten it down and it solves the problems and it goes away. And industry's been saying for a decade or so that they know how to solve those leaks. They're working on it. It's getting better and better. There are leaks. Pipes leak, gases leak, but most of the emissions are purposeful and they're a routine part of the way that natural gas is developed and used from hydraulic fracturing. There's no way for them to develop the gas without getting it. And here's sort of a list, but let me just run through an example or two. Methane's an invisible gas. You can't see it without specialized equipment, and this is from an article in the New York Times, excellent piece from November of 2019. The top shows a gas processing facility, storage and processing, as you'd see it with a naked eye, a normal camera. On the bottom is a special camera tuned to the infrared radiation of methane. So what looks like smoke there is not smoke, it's methane that's visible in that specialized camera. And you can see methane is coming out of one of those stacks. This is a routine pressure release. It happens all of the time. Sometimes they burn the methane. That's called flaring. It creates a lot of local air pollution, terrible from an environmental justice standpoint, but better for the climate. Industry tends to assume that when you burn it, all of the methane is combusted, and that's not true. And in fact, in my paper, I was using the best data as of a year or so ago and assuming there was a 98% efficiency of combustion. There's a new paper that came out about, 5 or 6 weeks ago saying that no, that's ideal lab conditions, and when you look at real-world conditions, when the wind picks up, the flaring efficiency goes down. So on a windy day, the sort of picture is shown here, 40% of the methane escapes unburned into the atmosphere. They have to release it for pressure reasons, safety reasons. If you burn it, again, it's better for the climate, but nowhere near as good as people have claimed in the past. And then one more example, and this is taken very near my home in upstate New York. What you see on the right there looks like steam coming out of the ground, and I've told you that methane is invisible, so what's that? That's a super rapid release of methane, and it is a cloud. It super cools the atmosphere around it from this release, and so it's condensing air vapor into clouds, and that's what you're seeing there. Why are they doing that? This is called a blowdown. And in this case, it was an emergency. They had to go in and do some maintenance. But they do it all the time for routine maintenance. You cannot weld on a pipeline full of methane. You have to release it to the atmosphere. And it doesn't happen every day, but it happens on a routine basis, and it's a substantial amount of what we should not refer to as methane leaks. They are methane emissions. Industry has no alternative to pipeline maintenance other than these breakdowns. So that's my summary. Blue hydrogen is worse for the climate than if we're simply to burn fossil natural gas. It really makes no sense except as a greenwashing industry approach. And LNG has the largest greenhouse gas footprint of any fuel, 33% larger than coal. We need to move away from all fossil fuels as quickly as possible, as the IPCC has said, and as the nations of the world agreed in Paris back in December 2015. We should move away from LNG as quickly as possible, and we in the United States are the world's largest exporter. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Next is Daniel Cohen. His presentation is called What's Actually Needed to Confront Climate Change.
Thank you. So great to be here. And we've heard 3 speakers about what we need not to be doing, about solutions that don't work, that are making climate change worse, that are costing large amounts of money for very little benefit. So what's actually needed? We know that we don't have time to waste on solutions that aren't working because we're already hitting up against the targets that we set in the Paris Agreement. We're already 1.4 Celsius, well over 2 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than we were at the start of the Industrial Revolution. And we need to be rapidly moving to much lower emissions if we want to hit our climate goals. And we need to be acting now with solutions that really do work. If we stay with the status quo of where the world is heading, it's not headed to ever higher emissions like we thought when I began teaching at Rice in 2006, but we're in this, what I called in my book, climate gridlock. We're stuck with emissions plateauing, creeping up year after year, not coming down to the rate they need to. If we want to be able to hold warming to 2 degrees Celsius, we need a very rapid decline of emissions, getting close to net zero in the second half of this century. So how do we do that? The core of anything that needs to happen is building up a future of clean energy. Depending on the way you do the accounting, fossil fuels now provide 80 to 90% of the US, 80 to 90% of the world's energy. We need to switch that to 80 or 90 or more percent clean energy, and the only way we can build that up is with three central pillars, is by focusing on efficiency, by focusing on a clean electricity supply, and then using that clean electricity to electrify everything we can, electric cars, heat pumps, and so on, and making fuels that are truly clean, most likely made with electricity. And only if we can address that central part, address the fossil fuels that are causing 37 billion tons a year of emissions, only then can carbon sinks begin to offset a bit of those emissions. And while we're doing this, of course, we need to be addressing the other greenhouse gases too. Those pillars, that my book went to press just as Biden was taking office, and is pretty much what the White House came with its strategy when President Biden was the first US president to commit the United States to a net zero future. The same three central pillars were what going to get the US emissions from 6.5 billion tons a year as a nation down to 1, was all going to come from moving away from fossil fuels to cleaner sources. Again, those three central pillars, efficiency, clean electricity, electrification, and clean fuels, have to be at the heart of it. Why do we need these? Well, if we don't make ourselves more efficient, we're going to need twice as many solar farms, twice as many wind farms, twice as many nuclear reactors, power lines. Whatever it is that we need to do will be larger if we don't act as efficiently as possible. Of course, we need clean electricity for it to be worthwhile to switch to electric cars, heat pumps, electrified industry, and so forth. And what's pivotal is we need to be electrifying things because that's the only way to be as efficient as we can. My electric car motor is a few times as efficient as an internal combustion engine ever could be. An electric heat pump is a few times as efficient as a gas or oil furnace could ever be. And only when we have so much clean electricity left over from doing all the things that electricity is needed for, the refrigerators, the air conditioners, the appliances, the computers, and the huge demand that's going to come from data centers and other sources, once we have the electricity that's needed to go to heat pumps, that goes to electric cars, and we have enough left over, it's going to be necessary to use some of it to make green hydrogen, to make fuels derived from hydrogen. Hydrogen isn't bad in and of itself. It's bad when it's being made from methane, with leaks, with steam, with all the emissions that go into that process, but we'll need some sort of fuels for things that need liquid fuels to power them. And then I'm not sure whether, if we had so much clean electricity coming out of our ears, would it make sense to power some devices like this that are probably better carbon removal strategies, but only if we've already gotten everything else replaced would it make sense even to consider technologies like the ones that are being built in the Permian Basin this year. Any time that we still have fossil fuel electricity on the grid and any clean electricity that we're not using to close or reduce the use of those plants, that we're wasting that clean electricity on very, very inefficient controls that are pulling CO2 out of the air where it's so dilute, is going to be clean electricity that's wasted from where it's really needed to be used. The various groups that have looked at how we solve this have found that the only way we get there is, again, with these central pillars. IRENA has found that by going to more efficiency, we can have a world that is more prosperous, that has more people, that addresses energy poverty and brings electricity to places that don't have electricity today, and yet through efficiency could actually have less primary energy use than today by electrifying many of the end uses. That requires going to replacing the very inefficient uses of fossil fuels with internal combustion engines, with furnaces, switching those over to electric cars, to electric heat pumps, so electricity becomes a bigger share of the economy. And then there is a role that needs to be played by hydrogen and fuels derived from cleanly produced hydrogen for things that can't be electrified. Again, efficiency central to this, and efficiency that depends on electrifying our heat, electrifying industry, electrifying cars. That can get us halfway of where we need to be on the way to net zero. Again, the technology that can get us there by going to heat pumps, we can have our heating of our homes and our businesses be 3 times as efficient as it would be by burning fossil fuels. Directly by using electric cars, even once we've gotten to that clean electricity, the most efficient way to use it would not be with hydrogen cars, would not be with making synthetic fuels, but we can go twice as far on each amount of wind or solar that we produce if we go with the efficiency that's coming with the electric cars and with costs that are coming down. Amazed the travel that I got to do for my next book, traveling through Europe, seeing how ubiquitous the electric car chargers are, traveling to China, to BYD's headquarters and elsewhere, and seeing the very rapid charging technologies, the cars, where electric cars now are cheaper than any gasoline car you can buy on the US market today. So how does this come together across industries? Is strategies that would take us to a low carbon, a low warming solution, find that we need to electrify the buildings, the industry, the transportation sector is going to be essential for achieving that. And strategies that look at what technologies are going to be needed for that find we need to switch to heat pump technologies, to electric motor technologies as soon as we can. We don't have time to waste on technologies that don't work. What makes this possible is that the cost of technologies have changed tremendously since just very recent times, since, as we heard, when C12 was founded, it seemed too expensive to replace coal plants with solar and wind. Solar was the most expensive way to make electricity in the world. My energy environment class at Rice, I got started in 2007, so off the left edge of the chart. It was off the chart. It was hundreds of dollars a megawatt hour to make electricity with solar. Now, if you look at the global data, and this is actually, I think, more relevant than the US specific data that's often shown, is that wind and solar are now the cheapest forms of electricity that have ever been created. The costs of wind and solar on a global basis in places where it's windy and sunny are now lower than any other source of electricity has ever been. This averages in places where we have lots of tariffs, such as the United States, averaged in with countries that don't have those tariffs, where actually the wind and solar costs are substantially lower than this global average that you see there. So we can actually save money by moving to these technologies. What's driven down the cost is learning by doing. What we find with each of these renewable energy technologies is because they're modular, the more that we do them, the more that comes down. And so what you see is as deployment has gone up globally, as the total amount that's ever been installed in the world has gone to the right, the cost has come down with about typically a 20% or so reduction in cost for each doubling. That's why when people have been forecasting how much solar, how much wind, how much batteries would be deployed, they keep getting it wrong because they keep forgetting that virtuous cycle that more deployments bring down costs, which bring more deployments. And so when the IEA forecasted how much would be deployed, they thought that by 2040 we would get to a point that we might be adding 100 gigawatts a year. In fact, last year, 593 gigawatts. If this was actually done to scale, this would be somewhere near the ceiling of this synagogue, how high the deployments have gone by letting the cheapest technologies win out and be deployed. So what do we need to do to make that happen? We need to be going along this curve. And fortunately for us, this is not, we see a boulder, we see people, we think Sisyphus. We think of Sisyphus pushing that boulder up the hill, that futile effort where the boulder's going to fall back upon him each night. The cost and deployment curves on technologies that can be modularized like this tend towards lower costs, but it's an incredibly sticky curve. There's a lot of friction, a lot of things slow down. We need as much pushes and pulls as possible to get to where we need to be, to get the emission reduction fast enough to meet our climate goals. And we need pushes for that with research, with development, with demonstration. But if I had worked with our graphic designer to do this to scale, I would have put even 3 times as many people on the other side. What's really needed, what drives this forward, is to say, if you build those clean technologies, we will buy them, we will deploy them, we will get them out there. whatever the strategy is, different countries, different companies, different people have different ways of bringing these forward. But one way or another, we need the market demand to pull these forward so that we can continue to have that virtuous cycle of bringing costs down, bringing deployments up. And so together with this approach of learning by doing, driven by action, by focusing our investments, focusing our research, focusing whatever policies we can on technologies that work rather than technologies that are a waste of time, we can build up the clean energy future that we need and actually have more energy accessibility, more energy abundance in more affordable ways with less emissions than we've ever had before.
Thank you, Charles. And our cleanup hitter, Robert Bullard, his presentation is called Why Carbon Capture and Storage is Not a Real or Just Climate Solution.
Good evening. Good evening. Let me stretch. My job is to connect the dots and to bring things together. Over the last 4 decades, I've written 18 books using science, research, data, facts. But having the facts, having the science, having the data, having the research is not enough to achieve transformative change. We must marry all of that with action. That's our movement. America is segregated, and so is pollution. If we look at the whole issue of CCS and hydrogen and where they go, they just don't go anywhere and everywhere. There's some places, and place matters. I wrote a book in 1990 called Dumping in Dixie, Race, Class, and Environmental Quality. That was the first book to link pollution, poverty, and race, and look at who gets dumped on. And it's not just Dixie. As I said, place matters. Environmental protection and environmental enforcement and where things go that other people don't want, it's now a whole movement, and it's called environmental justice. Your zip code matters. You tell me your zip code, I can tell you almost how healthy you are. In some cases, zip code is more predictive than your genetic code. It's no accident that the poorest people in the U.S. have the worst health, the most degraded physical environments, and have the greatest vulnerability to climate change. I wrote a book in 1994, 30 years ago, called Residential Apartheid, The American Legacy. It looks at housing discrimination, racial segregation, and redlining. And if we look at the impact of redlining and racial segregation and racism in housing, we can see that those patterns are very predictive of which communities and which populations have elevated environmental, economic, climate, and health risks. Environmental threats track closely with historical redlining. Redlined neighborhoods are more likely to be waste dumping grounds, industrial pollution sacrifice zones, nature-deprived areas, urban heat islands, flood zones, food deserts, energy insecurity hotspots, and are more likely to get left out of FEMA disaster funding. Neighborhoods kill, and particularly policies that push things that other people don't want in those neighborhoods. Who's most likely to get polluted? EPA study in 2018 showed that in 46 states, people of color have more pollution in their neighborhoods than whites. If we look at which people face more pollution and specific types of pollution, again, that pattern holds true across the board, and different types of pollution. In some cases, some populations are exposed to more pollution than they create. For example, black populations are exposed to 56% more pollution than they cause. Hispanics, 63% more pollution. whereas white populations enjoy pollution advantage, meaning they breathe 17% less air pollution than they cause. Well, why is that? America is segregated and so is pollution. Threats from living on the fence line with dirty energy. I took this picture in 2011 when I came back to Houston. This is not trick photography. This is in Manchester, homes across the street from refineries. There's a price that communities pay when we talk about oil and gas and fossil fuels. The amount of money that's lost and health that's lost is no accident that this is something that we need to address quickly. If you map where all the oil refineries are located in 32 states, half of the people that live in increased distances where cancer risks are elevated are people of color. People of color make up about 42% of the U.S. population. If you look at the Houston Ship Channel, it's concentration of petrochemicals, refineries, and all kinds of polluting facilities, and plans for putting CCS. You have the world's largest concentration, the world's largest medical center, Texas Medical Center, but a short distance away, 25, 30 minutes, depending on traffic, you have the largest concentration of pollution coming from industries. And this is a school that's located across from a tree line from a refinery, Cesar Chavez High School. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out who goes to school there. When we talk about the issue of LNG, we did a study, came out last year, liquefying the Gulf Coast, to look at where LNG facilities are located in Texas and Louisiana, and again, who lives nearby. Not rocket science, we can predict who most likely live near these facilities. It's populations that are oftentimes disadvantaged, low income, less high school. And when we talk about these facilities bringing about an economic renaissance, that's a myth. Living across the fence does not bring prosperity. You get pollution, you get poverty, and you get sick. Carbon capture is an experiment. When we talk about the risk of vulnerable populations, we talk about spending tax dollars on a boondoggle. When we talk about what was done in the Biden administration created a White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. We advised not to fund CCS. Carbon capture storage is going to school. There are grants given out for universities to develop curricula for universities, high school, and middle schools. And promoting this risky, unproven technology and pawning it off as being science and teaching our kids this. It's easier to get a Black Studies it's harder to get Black Studies or ethnic studies in our schools than it is to get CCS. That should not be. When we talk about this whole idea of government, billions of dollars of DOE under the Inflation Reduction Act being spent on this unproven technology, billions of dollars, I'll give an example of my university, Bullitt Center. We got a grant from DOE, a cooperative agreement. We're supposed to have $1.5 million to work on clean energy for communities in the Gulf Coast and assisting HBCUs and MSIs put solar and green infrastructure on the campus. When the DOE folks came down to the campus, came to Houston, sitting in my conference room, said, no, this is not for clean energy, it's for CCS. Bait and switch. We said, no, thank you. Take your $1.5 million and do whatever you want to with it. Supposed to be community benefits proposal, a community benefits program, a community benefits agreements. We said, no, CCS, there are no community benefits that we would promote for this. This is a sugar pill laced with poison. Tastes sweet, but it'll kill you just the same. We say, just say no. Our communities need a just transition. We don't need things that are being promoted and pushed out and sold and having people think that they're getting something that will assist them and make their communities more healthy, livable, resilient, and sustainable. We need real solutions. We need just solutions. We don't need our communities somehow to be sacrificed and put in a box and somehow closed, and we say there's no more use for you. Our communities are not throwaway communities. Our communities that have historically borne the burden of fossil fuels, oil and gas. We have borne the cost of these externalities, but we have not gotten the benefits from it. We should not make the same mistake as we transition to a clean energy economy. When we talk about all the great stuff with clean energy and renewables and EVs and all these, the good things that we're talking about, we have to have, as I said before, a just transition. That's what we're talking about. I got 2 minutes and 12 seconds, but I don't need that. I have made my point, and I stand by them. Thank you very much.
Well done, Dr. Bullard. We'll start the Q&A. I'd like to start with Robert Howarth, and you all feel free to enter in at any point. You were just in Davos at the World Economic Forum. What's your sense of climate awareness with the people who are running the world?
I can only shake my head. You know, it's the first time I ever went to the World Economic Forum. It's not the crowd I usually hang out with. But there is an organization that for each of the past 15 years has tried to have a climate presence, and they invited me and others to go and speak primarily on the liquefied natural gas issue. And the organizers told me, I mean, my sense of being there was one of shock, quite frankly, but what the organizers said was they were shocked too, the organizers that brought me in that for most of the last decade, they said that a third to two-thirds of the participants there were talking about climate pretty regularly, and that was not the case this time around. The conversation was artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence, they want to be in it. This is the 0.01%, right? They want to be part of that. They seem to have this blind faith that it's going to solve the world problems, including climate. And, you know, when I would talk to people, there are clearly people there who are interested, but the answer you tend to get is, well, isn't that something that artificial intelligence can figure out how to reduce those methane emissions? I found it, I'm much happier to be here with you all tonight.
Chris Tomlinson, do energy transition economics give you hope? In recent years, much of coal use got displaced from competition from cheaper energy. Oil and gas is also facing competition from way cheaper renewables. What are you watching for?
I mean, the economics give me hope. The politics don't. You know, we're looking at what's happening in the Texas legislature right now when it comes to efforts to basically kneecap renewables. And it's because renewables are taking the lead. They are the economic best practice at this point. However, as I pointed out, it is a $4.3 trillion a year industry. It is the bedrock of the Texas economy. It employs tens of thousands of people. Most of the wealth that comes into Houston comes from the fossil fuel industry. And therefore, the politicians want to protect that. If you take away oil and gas, if we're not doing LNG, Texas becomes like Oklahoma or Kansas. You know, I mean, Oklahoma's got oil and gas. I mean, our economic outlook changes dramatically. And, you know, we were talking at dinner about a column I wrote about Dan Friedkin, a local Houston billionaire who is the producer of the TV show Landman, which, okay, how many have seen it? No, not that, okay. Not as many as I expected. But it is fossil fuel propaganda. You know, so it's now about politics, it's now about propaganda, it's no longer economics. And the thing to always remember about politics, and this is something that every CEO of every fossil fuel company knows all too well, is that politics changes quickly. It will change quickly. And so they are going to go along to get along, but when things change, they will change. And we've seen that before, and I think we'll see it again.
This is for Daniel Cohen. Your presentation called for efficiency outpacing growth in demand. Do you see an example from a country or a city or a business who is doing this right?
Well, in terms of efficiency outpacing growth, even in the United States, for all our flaws, we've achieved that. Energy use has not gone up, even as the economy has doubled, has gotten so much larger as we have more people. So we aren't doing it best, but it's very possible to achieve this. Traveling through Europe as I research the next book, see places where the prosperity is just as high, and yet everything is done usually with half or less as much energy. Traveling through Iceland, through Denmark, where district heating is the norm, and this makes it much easier to heat buildings efficiently, to switch over to heat pumps, which are a more efficient technology, where it's the norm that the lights go off when they're not in use. So so much that can be money saving, so much that gets prioritized, and more where that's the culture, where natural gas and electricity aren't as cheap as they are here, and so huge amounts that can be done with more efficiency and conservation.
Charles Harvey, carbon, you mentioned Illinois. Carbon storage has potential for leaking into aquifers and water supplies. What was your involvement in the legal case in Illinois? Can you elaborate on what happened with that carbon leak that was, as you say, uniquely monitored?
It wasn't a legal case. It was a bill in front of the Illinois Senate and House that passed. And it sounds like the governor is going to sign it. And what the bill will do is stop proposed CCS projects, except for one that's already spent $50 million or something. It gets grandfathered in, that are also in the Mount Simons aquifer below the Mahomet aquifer, which is the sole source drinking water supply for a lot of Illinois. So a lot of the motivation for this bill was to protect their drinking water. Not so much about climate change. And I think they're right. I would certainly not want to live above a giant bubble of buoyant gas. It's an enormous force pushing up. And it first would pass through the drinking water. So I think they're right. The politics are interesting. It passed overwhelmingly because the Democrats, the people who had called me in, were concerned about the drinking water. A lot of Republicans also wanted to stop it. And as one guy put it, because we know carbon dioxide is plant food, we should be putting more of it into the air rather than less. So it was this great political union of both sides.
Well, I understand that Republicans in Louisiana are against carbon storage, even though the White House is for it. We're seeing some Republicans and
So this
even the governor of Florida, DeSantis, call it a scam.
That's right. So I don't know anything about national politics that you don't know, but this is kind of actually a fun thing to watch. Because you've got two sides that are fundamentally dishonest or delusional. It's a little hard to tell, okay? So on the one side, you have the oil companies who spent tremendous resources and more than a decade arguing that climate change is a fraud. And then they kind of switched directions to promoting what we're calling, for this get-together, false solutions. Then on the other side, and these are the more kind of local MAGA crowd, they look at CCS subsidies and say, well, that's a deep state scheme that's, getting our tax dollars for this fraud that's climate change. So these two groups that are both, MAGA Republicans, are on opposite sides of these issues for reasons none of which are correct, actually. So I don't know. I've said before, it'd be fun to be a fly on the wall when an argument happens between them, but yeah.
Thank you. Well, let's get into politics a little bit. Dr. Bullard, I want to bring out something you said this afternoon at Rice, that we need justice, we need voting, we need democracy in order to fix climate. You cannot just fix climate by itself. Could you explain how social justice, voting, democracy helps us get to fixing climate?
Yes.
I knew you could.
Well, climate change will exacerbate all of the existing disparities, whether it's health, economic, environmental, social, racial, etc. And our justice framework overlay looks at climate change more than greenhouse gases and parts per million. It involves examining the responsibility, who caused this problem, and then vulnerability, who's most likely to be impacted disproportionately. First, worst, and longest. If we think we can build it and pass it and somehow not deal with the fact that zip code, as I said before, is a potent predictor of health and well-being and how long you live and what you have access to opportunity, etc. So if we are to address this climate crisis that we're in, that is human-made, then we must address those other human-made inequities and disparities. That's our movement, environmental and climate justice. It's embedded in this whole idea that the science is there, the solutions are there. But when we talk about addressing those political and social and economic human elements, it becomes very difficult because we all have special interests. We all have ideas as to what we want to achieve and how we want to get there, until we just lay it bare that what we're talking about, and we have to not be afraid to put justice after the climate. There was a time when climate change, the climate change movement that came out of the environmental movement, the Greens, they were afraid to talk about justice, fairness, and equity. And they got very little things done until they brought us in, who brought the justice part, the hard-hitting part, the part where you can make a difference on the ground, because climate change is not affecting everybody in the same way. We're not talking 30 years from now. We're talking communities that are underwater right now, or they are in droughts, or they're impacted by tremendous kinds of of climate impacts. And so that's what when you get to the nitty-gritty, that's how we can solve this problem, by making sure that we are not afraid to bring in the justice part and the equity part. It's not affirmative action, it's not DEI. Breathing does not have anything to do with no damn DEI. So when we talk about this, this is a real issue of justice, fairness, and equity. Now you asked me, that's my answer.
Thank you for your answer. This is for all of you. Is there any appropriate use somewhere for carbon capture or hydrogen or LNG?
Let me start with the last part of it. LNG, no, right? It's just, it has the worst footprint of any fossil fuel. We need to be moving away from all fossil fuels. That's not the one to be going with. Hydrogen's a little bit more complicated. We want to be moving away from hydrogen made from fossil fuels. Today, you know, the proponents of hydrogen are talking about it as an energy source or energy storage. Traditionally, we haven't, as a society, used it in that way. We use hydrogen mostly in the chemical industry, in the fertilizer industry. Fertilizers, synthetic nitrogen fertilizers made from hydrogen, et cetera. We have a world in which we want to continue to make synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, right? Now that's made from fossil gas-produced hydrogen. We should be moving that towards green hydrogen. But I think my colleague here did an excellent job of saying it's a role for hydrogen, but it's small. It's not the hydrogen coming from fossil fuels. And I think hydrogen's been wildly overhyped over the last half dozen years or so. I'll leave the carbon capture to my friends who are more expert in that.
Yeah, I was listening to Charles's presentation. Well, if there's a little bit of renewable energy left over from all this demand, perhaps we can get to green hydrogen.
Yeah, maybe that's where we should be using hydrogen. And the first use ought to be to replace the fossil uses of hydrogen, which we want and need as a society, nitrogen fertilizer being one. We use too much nitrogen fertilizer, but we want some, right? So, and it's becoming more green.
Yeah. Hydrogen made in the right way is going to be part of the solution. It's going to be smaller than the other aspects, but it is important. I've been writing the next book, looking at some of the visions of how we would address energy needs, even going back to the 70s when they thought it would be nuclear power plants as the electricity. People realized that we were going to have non-fossil ways of making electricity. Even then, we're starting to think, how do we get that into liquid, into gas forms? And hydrogen is a way to get there for things that you can't electrify. When you can electrify it, it's always more efficient to do that. But we have uses of hydrogen for fertilizers, for ammonia, for other purposes already that we're making in dirty ways that need to be cleaned up. And we have certain things in between. There's ridiculous uses of hydrogen that, yes, you could use hydrogen, but it doesn't make sense even if you made it cleanly. But there are rungs in between. Michael Liebrich writes of it as a hydrogen ladder. There are a couple levels down the rung where if we could make it cleanly enough, if we could make fuel cells better, and if we could start finding ways to pair it with some carbon from biosources where you could start to make hydrogen-derived fuels that would make sense for certain uses, and it could be a part of the solution that does need to be part. So we shouldn't throw out all hydrogen just because the blue hydrogen, just because the gray hydrogen isn't the way to go.
My caution light is blinking, and what I say is we should not enter into any type of technology and arrangement that are experimental, that somehow place those populations that has historically borne the burden for all of these things that have been mistakes. So let's not, my caution light is blinking, and we want to make sure that we don't somehow sacrifice even a little bit of extra risk on those populations that have historically been left out and left behind to get the good stuff, but always end up getting more than their fair share of the bad stuff. That's just my caution light.
And is there any place for carbon capture?
I thought Daniel put it really well. You know, if we have abundant clean energy, sure. But I think there's another advantage to the fossil fuel companies of carbon capture and sequestration, and that is that kind of like we're here tonight, we're talking about it. I don't even think they believe it's ever going to be large. And so the more we talk, I mean, not us, but the more that other people talk about it, and the more that they can describe it as a climate solution, the more it helps them kind of give this notion that we're going to be okay, when in fact we're not going to be okay unless we do the things that really work.
I showed a slide in class today from a recent JP Morgan report where they divided the number of news articles and publications about carbon capture by the number of tons of carbon that have actually been captured by those projects. And it is the highest ratio of articles and hype to actual amount of capture that has ever been seen.
Okay.
Blame the newspaper guy.
So that's not our fault. No, but I want to point out, though, that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says we need some carbon capture. It's part of their 1.5 degrees Celsius scenario, is that they imagine there will be carbon capture. It would not be carbon capture to offset future fossil fuel consumption, but they see some use for it. And if y'all invited a columnist, all right, so I have to be a devil's advocate as well. This is an industry that has done some pretty remarkable things that academics have told them was impossible in the past. So, yes, nothing pains me more than when I get an email that begins, "I am a professional engineer," because I know what's following is going to be unpleasant. But they've got a little bit of a point, don't y'all think?
No.
Let me speak to the IPCC part of it. The IPCC is a big, complicated document. I refer to it, clearly I'm a believer, right? It's got different working groups. Working group 1 is the physical science basis. Working group 3 is the one you're referring to, is on the solutions side of it. I've talked to the people who wrote that, and there's a big debate going on in the science community about that at this point in time. And they don't really, what they say is, it's going to be too hard, too slow to get the renewable technologies in there. And given this rate that we're going, we got to do something else. So maybe carbon capture. There's not a lot of deep thought behind it. And that's a political view on their part. It becomes self-fulfilling because, we can't do it fast enough and therefore we'll do this other thing. I think we need to do it fast enough. We'll see. There's a new IPCC being set up now. They'll start again in the fall or January and issue a report in a few years. My guess is you'll see a substantially different thing. I could be wrong. It's a moving document. It's a reflection of what the community thinks, lagged by a little because it's, when you try to get consensus document of hundreds and hundreds of people with government buy-in, it's inherently conservative.
Yeah. For 1.5 degrees, we will need to pull CO2 from the air because we're already virtually at 1.5, and so it becomes a physical impossibility otherwise. What more people are looking at these days is trying to stay to the 2-degree target where you have a little bit of breathing room to work with, and there are thousands of scenarios that have been put forth about how that might be done, and some of them would have carbon capture, some of them would rely more on renewables, some would have a role for nuclear, although none of them actually have that big of a role for nuclear. They have different amounts of hydrogen, different amounts of bioenergy, so they're all over the map. The vast majority of them were developed at times when we thought that solar and batteries would be far more expensive than they are today, and they were with models that didn't really have learning by doing to the extent that it happens, that we keep seeing year after year, of the cost coming down, of the ways that the costs have gotten to. They usually don't have electric cars getting to the cost that they've already gotten to in places that don't have the tariffs on them. And IPCC, interestingly, excluded a lot of studies that don't happen in the the way that IPCC's Working Group 3 likes for those models to be. So there's groups of scholars who have come up with alternate approaches. You can debate whether they're better or worse, but they don't have a carbon cycle model attached to them, and so they get ignored by the IPCC, but have shown alternate pathways of staying below 2 degrees C without any carbon capture, with much larger, up to above 80, if not 100% or near 100% focus on renewable technologies that hundreds of peer-reviewed papers that have shown it, but often get excluded from key chapters of the IPCC to be included. So there are a variety of approaches. Each have their own technical barriers, each have their own pros and cons, and different people affected. But the role of carbon capture really could be quite different depending on the path that we choose to go.
Say a few things about that. First of all, this argument that it's the bridge to renewables, I think we'd all agree is completely ridiculous now. We can build renewables much faster than we could build, usually for the first time ever, one of these carbon capture and sequestration systems. Another thing about the IPCC is that if you dig into their, I don't know what it is, 20,000 page, or so, I don't know, details on this, it is not really saying that. For political reasons I don't understand, as you move into the more concise, abridged, until you get to, what is it, the executive summary for policymakers, CCS becomes trumpeted in a way that it is not by all the data deep down in it. And there's this kind of promotion of it that I think something Daniel shows helps to explain this. There was a plot Daniel showed that we call often the hedgehog plot, that shows the growth of solar and then all the predictions. So every year the future is predicted to be flat, and every year, in fact, there's more solar. And I think that thinking gets into the IPCC. There is another kind of hedgehog that you can draw for CCS, where every year the projections say that it's going to explode next year, and we're going to get up to gigatons of it in a couple of years. And every year what happens is it stays flat. And in fact, it's all used for enhanced oil recovery, so it actually produces CO2. And that also, those projections find their way into things like the IPCC. But I don't really understand how year after year these projectors could get it wrong every time. But anyway, I think they're getting better now. But
They are. Those are excellent points. They are getting better, and I think the science policy community as a whole now recognizes those factors. And so I'm sure some of that will hold over in the next version of the IPCC, but I think it'll be less so than what you've seen before.
Chris, you look like you had something on your mind.
Oh, no, I think I've stirred enough.
Okay. Have you guys heard about nature-based carbon capture? I happen to be in a working group at Rice Baker Institute, very responsible group where you get paid for a credit only after you measure. It takes a couple of years, and you have to prove that you actually had some additionality.
so that's my day job.
That's your day job?
Yeah, it's a hobby.
You're a carbon trader?
No, I'm not a carbon trader. I work on wetlands and carbon, sequestration in it. So this fits into like, will we have CCS in the future? Because in order to, even to meet 2, maybe we need to 2 degrees limit. We need to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But the other way to do it is through photosynthesis and natural ecosystems. And I think we should do that first. It's less expensive, has all innumerable other advantages. But the carbon credit, voluntary carbon credit, or even if there's a government one, is a very peculiar way to do it. It's not really that amenable to a market-based solution, because there are so many motivations to cheat, basically. Mm-hmm. When you produce a carbon credit and sell it, you want to say that you pulled as much carbon as possible out of the air. The person buying it also wants to say the same thing. and neither person has any interest in finding out if they were wrong. And then there's a third party that validates or verifies these things. They are paid by the first two parties. Okay? There's, in other business transactions, there's usually, say, an insurer who is on the hook if something goes terribly wrong. These aren't insured, and there's no kind of, what do you call it, insurance? The people go out and assessor or whatever.
Adjuster.
Adjuster, thank you. There's no adjuster for carbon credits. So the whole thing is sketchy.
Yeah. I think the size that they could get to, if you look at all the possibilities out there, is probably going to be in the low single-digit billions of tons a year at a time when we're releasing 37 billion tons a year of CO2. So it's only, part of the solution if it doesn't become a license to keep the rest of those fossil fuel emissions so high. It can only offset some small part of this amount. And if you look at the most ambitious strategies of doing everything possible with soils, with forests, with the other nature-based approaches, you're only able to offset 1 or 2/10 of a degree of the warming at a time when we're on pace to be at a 3-degree warming world. So it's part of it, but it's not the whole solution. And because it's a small part of it, I look at a lot at what are the side effects. And I was talking about this with Rice students who came to our event this afternoon, is would we want to do this even if it's way beyond the decimal point of how much it matters to the thermometer? Is this something that we want because it makes our farms better, our ranches better, because it helps natural ecosystem, it helps biodiversity? Is it somehow making a better world, a better community for what we want? Is it advancing the causes of environmental justice or climate justice? Then it's a good thing. If we're paying for row crops of invasive trees coming in, all planted the same way and hurting the natural ecosystems just because we think it's giving us license to go emit an extra ton of CO2, then it's doing more harm than good. So I think we need to look at the other effects beyond just what it does to the tons of CO2.
I have a question for you, Chris, and Daniel, and then one last question for everybody. This is a Texas grid question, because you were talking about efficiency, Daniel. When people talk about the Texas grid or grids, all grids really, it's mostly about just increasing power generation. Do you see a likely answer for actually controlling energy demand?
No. Well, I mean, it's no one has. There's no financial incentive to control demand, right? I mean, then the financial incentive is to build stuff where the land is cheap and there's low regulation. You can get away with damn near anything, which is why people come to Texas. And ERCOT, the grid operator, is by law required to hook up new customers as fast as they possibly can. And there is no law or incentive to conserve or control energy. And I think we talk about AI, and in Texas there's this crazy idea that we're going to double demand on the grid just to meet the demands of AI and data centers. And we want to think that when you say AI, you're thinking, oh, ChatGPT, it's that thing I have a conversation with. I use AI to copy edit my columns before I turn them into my editor so that he thinks I'm better than I am. Doesn't write my columns, it just fixes my commas, okay? But that's not what AI hype is about. AI is a weapon. Y'all don't realize it. AI is a weapons system. That is why everyone is so crazy about it. It's why they want to spend so much money. It's why they want to spend so much energy. You go to CERAWeek or you go to South by Southwest, it's not a fun thing. It is a weapon system. And everyone's worried that China's going to have a better AI weapon system than we are. And that's the way this argument is posed. And when you make something a national security issue, then you're far more likely to just give them whatever they want because the safety of the country depends on it. I don't think that's completely true, but that is how the discussion is framed now in the halls of power. And that's why I don't know. There'll be no attempt to slow it down.
Any hope for the Texas grid, Daniel Cohen?
Yeah, I mean, it's
On
that inaction and that inertia is a choice. It's our homes use twice as much electricity as homes in some other states, as homes in some other countries. There are money-saving choices that we could be making with heat pumps, with efficiency, with more weather stripping, with efficient windows, go on and on down the list. Smart thermostats that would all be saving us money, would all be reducing the demands on the grid, would make us more resilient when the next winter storm or heat wave hits. There's no economic reason why we're not doing it. It's difficult to house by house to make those choices, to have the policies incentivize it when utilities make money by selling us more power. But the economics is there. The reason the technologies are there. It's certainly possible, but I agree that policy isn't doing that. But it's very doable to reduce that demand. And whether we keep the lights on is also a matter on the supply side of, do we allow the wind and solar to get built that wants to be built, that's waiting in queues to be built, the transmission projects that want to be built, to link them together, or does the legislature get in the way and slow down the projects the developers are ready to build, and keep from getting those power sources balanced with batteries that really could meet the demands of growth?
Charles, did you have something on your mind? Okay. My last question, and I'd like just to start with Chris and go down the row. The next few years will be very challenging, especially politically, to say the least. We're all on a hero's journey. How are you girding for it? What positive outcomes might you be visualizing? For me at the Progressive Forum, yeah, I'm worried, but I'm also excited. We've got more opportunities, we think, than ever to make a difference. What are your perspectives, Chris? Well, let's start with you.
You know, I'm an opinion writer. Not, you know, I spent 20 years as a real journalist, and now I just play one on TV. And I mouth off a lot, and I find that I am becoming more radicalized. I think I'm pulling fewer punches. I'm not trying to be as soothing and as middle of the road as I once was, because I don't. I'm not sure there's much room for negotiation, and I also think that this is a time where everyone who can lead should and must, because, like the column that's going to come out tomorrow morning, you know, since the inauguration, Democrats and the anti-Trumpers are like deer in the headlights, right? I mean, they're just kind of largely been frozen in place. And we're beginning to see people, you know, realize that they have power, that they have strength, that they can speak up, that resistance is possible, that you know, and even more necessary than ever before. So that's what I'm more focused on now, in a way that I think I haven't been in the decade that I've been writing my column.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. But there's a certain optimism in your question that I want to believe that the next couple years are going to be difficult. That's certainly true, but if things go bad, the rest of our lives could be tremendously difficult. And that, I have a similar kind of feeling because of that. I don't see a silver lining in this. I don't see how to say that Trump's environmental policies are in any way going to turn out somehow be good. The best thing I see in the policies is that they're so bad and incompetently enacted that it'll upset enough people that they'll get out and vote against it in the elections.
That's what seems to be happening in the street. it's just so incompetent that they're just demonstrations every day and people are waking up. Robert?
Yeah, well, it's a tough question, right? It's a tough time. I'd like to be optimistic. I'm not optimistic, but I agree with Charlie. You know, I fear mostly for our democracy and general future. The climate, which is something I've worked on for 40 years and I care deeply about, is secondary to that. We need to preserve our democracy, and we need to do everything we can to do that. I'm going to be putting my efforts towards that. I'm still going to keep my day job, and part of my day job is to teach a lot of freshmen who are really, really bright and try to keep them both informed and engaged. And I think that's important. There's a little bit of optimism. You know, under the first Trump administration, our state of New York finally moved and became very, very progressive on energy policy for a while. And we have a great climate law in New York that, if we really implemented, would be globe setting. Our current governor backed off of really doing it for much of the Biden administration because she kept waiting for the magic flow of dollars to come out of the White House to do it, so she wouldn't have to do the heavy lifting. And she can't do that anymore. None of our progressive governors can do that. So I do think we should push our states wherever we can to do what we can. And finally, you know, I'm pretty optimistic that other countries, much of the world, will move in the right direction on this, and they won't be looking to the U.S. And that makes me sad, but I think that's probably good for the planet at this point in time.
Daniel?
One thing that gives me hope, or is a need for perspective, is that not all of the sky is falling. Is that there, in many ways, that the environment is actually better, cleaner, healthier than it's ever been. The air is cleaner in Houston than it was when my mom grew up at this congregation. The water is cleaner. Kids aren't exposed to the lead levels that peaked from leaded gasoline that peaked when I was a toddler. The ozone layer is going back to its normal levels. We don't have DDT. All these aspects of progress, the cleaner water that we have, are immune from whatever goes on with an administration in Washington. But we are warming. We're talking about climate solutions, we're talking about climate. I don't have a bright picture for that right now when we're getting to that target that we set in Paris. So at least for this next 3 years, I think my hope on climate is going to be what's happening in the world outside of the United States. Is the traveling that I've been doing for my next book, travel through Europe and see the new geothermal technologies being put in Iceland, see the offshore wind, see the clean hydrogen pipelines that are being built, see how Germany is actually managing it, getting off of coal, even with the questionable decision about getting off nuclear at the same time. Traveling to China, sitting in a $15,000 leather seat, beautiful electric SUV that's been better than any gas or electric car that I can buy here, and not everyone is going to put 100-something% tariffs on those. Seeing the solar companies that are building solar panels for 9 cents a watt instead of 33 cents a watt that they are in the US, and seeing how that's going to open opportunities we're already seeing in Pakistan, where they're actually reducing coal use, having more electric reliability. Because if the US isn't taking these products, other parts of the world will. And so I think places that haven't had reliable electricity, haven't had clean electricity, there's going to be the opportunity that not everyone thinks climate change is a hoax. Not everyone thinks they need to put great walls of tariffs around their countries. And so I think there's going to be opportunities for the rest of the world to start showing how these technologies can work, and hopefully when sanity returns to Washington, the U.S. can start joining back in on those as well.
Dr. Bullard, you get the last word.
Well, let me just say, I am a boomer and Vietnam-era Marine Corps vet, hoorah.
Hoorah.
Still fighting, still standing. But Gen X, Y, Z, Zoomers outnumber my generation. But boomers and Zoomers together, we are the majority. We should act like it. I have hope, and I'm optimistic, and I have faith. But as my grandmother taught me in Sunday school, faith without work is what? Dead. Our movement for justice, whether it's climate, economic, environmental, health, racial justice, is a live movement. So let's get to work.
Thank you very much. You guys have been a great audience. We can feel your rapt attention. Thank you, gentlemen, for a beautiful evening. It's been amazing being with you. Thank you so much.